We're gonna sing the Friends song. So it's gonna be really great. Here we go. Friends,
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 friends. It's
friends,
a friend of friend. Friends, friends.
friends,
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 from friends, 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 and dun dun. Friends, friends,
friends,
friends,
friends,
friends, friends, friends. It's a friends, friends, friends.
friends, friends.
After last week, we just thought we'd do friends all the time. It'd be like we came over and saw Cheetah. It's good to see you. We talked about how everything at the end of the day here at the net is about friendship. And everything else follows after that, but friendship is primary. So we're gonna sing the friend song. Friends, friends,
friends, friends.
friends, friends, friends. I'm in a phone. Friends, friends, friends,
Friends, friends.
Oh yeah. So that is gold. So I enjoyed it. So we were actually in the kitchen just a moment ago. Michelle was there's a interesting thing though. It's like, oh, so at the end of the day, the net is about friendship. But there's also this kind of idea that philosophy is good for you. But then it's like, no, don't say that because we're not here to solve problems. Then there's an idea of it's good to be better, but no, don't say that because that's therapeutic. Then there's an idea of like it's good to improve, but what kind of improvement is good? What is bad? What are the lines between those differences? Because there does seem to be a kind of dangerous form of improvement, but then it also is like there is a real good form of improvement, right? So Michelle, I like your hat, Michelle, by the way. That's nice.
Thank you. Thanks. I actually have a pink one like this. This is my daughter's. So she allowed me to borrow her hat until I can. The pink version is a mushroom right now because our son used my hat to make a mushroom hat. So I was like, baby, do you mind if we go ahead and like take the mushroom stuff off so I can use my hat for the summertime? And he's like, yeah, that's okay. We can make it a mushroom again in the fall. But anyway, sorry, enough about the hat. So yeah, I do think this is a very important topic because Daniel and I were talking about a little bit about something where like there's this pharmaceutical concept of getting better. Hey, Amelia. And where it's just like, oh, like I pop a pill, I wait around to get better, and just sort of, it's not really, hey, Andrew. And so is that type of better, because also like Rivera will write about critiquing self-help industry and stuff like that. And there's totally validity to that, right? But there's also a way in which, we do, I don't know, maybe it just depends on the person, but I think like it is always kind of optimal for a tool to improve, right? That's like, just think about learning a language. Why are you learning the language? So you can actually speak the language. And so you do want to improve. I mean, unless you just want to stay forever at hola, ¿cómo estás? Like, you want to actually improve to actually have, be conversive. So I think there's something I was like, we shouldn't just completely dog on improvement or getting better. At the same time, there is the risk where Phillip Brief will talk about this, that Daniel will talk about belonging again, about like the therapeutic, right? The therapeutic, where it's just kind of always about like, this sort of self-improvement, but there's no teleology. We have no idea why we're trying to improve or how we're trying to improve. Does feeling happy make, or better today make you more improved? Like then we get into all those questions. But I do think there's a reality and a need for getting better, but I think maybe the language is better, like getting stronger. Like Daniel will use the gymnasium language, where it's like, maybe that would be better, where it's like, okay, I lift more weights, I get stronger, I can lift more weights now, versus just better, which is so amorphous and fuzzy. And is better because you are having pleasure all day, or is better like you getting to move rocks and you finish the trimmer, giving like a trim to your garden of rocks, like what? So yeah, I do think that it's important. It's important because I think we're silly to be a little repetitive, to just sort of completely say, well, never mind about that, we're all going to die anyway. I don't think that's helpful. But I do think that there can be problems with like, this whole kind of concept about like, just this self-optimization, but for what, and for what directionality with that. So anyways, that's my start here. Thanks.
Lovely. And Luber and Emilio missed the French song that we came up with after last week.
Man,
friends. I'm going to do that at least 10 times in this talk. Just randomly go, friends, and do like a guitar solo. It's going to be great.
With the ukulele.
It's going to be really good. Emilio, it's really great to see you. And Mr. Luber, it's a pleasure. Yeah, it's very interesting. So It's almost like you have like Luba was saying that self-help books are great as vomit throughout came out of his throat. And I feel that way too. Because there's like a lot of the self-help books are like how to be better at work. Okay, great. How to be better at alienation, how to be more productivity according to a productivity that is according to a metric you do not control. Or there's also a self-help that feels like take this book pill and everything will go be better, right? So there's this kind of medicative getting better. That's like taking a pill. But then there's another form of self-help that seems to be facing fear or living with negativity, not solving negativity, but managing negativity, right? There's like, Cadell will say, die better. Okay, well, if you die better, there's a sense in which there's a self-help in that, but it's not self-help as traditionally understood. I hope, Phillip, are you on the slope? He is on the slope. Oh, he's on the slope again. Look at this. Phillip's on the slope again. He is on it. He is dedicated. Phillip, we came up with a Friends song after last week. So here's friends, friends, friends of mine, friends, friends, friends. I'm gonna do that 10 times. It's gonna be great. I know. The friends, 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 and that's the guitar. But we're talking about how there's a way in which getting better is good, but then most of the time it's therapeutic self-help in favor of productivity at work. But what's the kind of getting better? Like Michelle, we were talking last week about how the end of the day, the net is about friendship. But there is also this, I want to get better at doing, in a sense, pointless things that people think is pointless, and I want to be more fearless in that. So there's a way in which that's getting better, but it seems qualitatively different from the be a better time manager or be better at work or be better in relationships that you mostly hear, right? So I do wonder, and then I'll give it to Mr. Luber and Emilio, I wonder if all true self-help is actually always something about facing fear. Like at the end of the day, is that always actually the only thing that actually helps you? Like in a sense, it has to be some kind of like fear-based thing. Now, there's also energy management that we talk about, and I know they talk about theory enneagram. There's like strategies to writing, but all of that gets into like your own, creating your own environment to do something that probably requires courage to do. That's the thing. It's almost like the courageous act comes first before you can even own your own productivity, if you will, right? So it's almost like when there are like good strategies of self-help, it's almost like none of that's going to really matter unless you first take a courageous step to like do something according to your own principles. So I'm thinking that. And friends, but let me pass it to Mr. Luber, Emilio, and Michelle, and then Clayton. Mr. Luber, I hope you are well today, sir.
You are so funny. You are hilarious. You can't even help it. You just have to make songs out of stuff. I love it. Phillip, you're skiing absolutely sick right now. But yeah, I didn't finish listening to last week's conversation, but I definitely got through a big chunk of it. Definitely got to the part where Ebert was like, "What the fuck are we doing?" kind of vibe. Um, I liked it. I liked it. I just to comment on what Michelle was saying, the problem I have with self-help books, and then I'll comment on the whole fear aspect that Daniel was bringing up, is just that it's let me help you versus let me outline or feel out the essence of the topic. And it's like when a self-help book isn't actually starting from, so to speak, the ground up, and it's just saying, here, let me tell you what you should do and how you should think, versus making you question yourself in order for you to have your own, let me tell myself how to. And like that's what philosophy does. Philosophy sketches out the essence for you to say, wait a second, I have this question and I just thought of my answer to it. And that's what true self-help is being able to come up with your own question because something provoked you. And philosophy is that provocation. Self-help book, self-help books to me, there is no provocation. Like you're not being provoked at all. Like it's smooth sailing. Like you need to go through a storm in order to help yourself. Like there is no going through a storm if you're just getting a list like you're baking something. All right, well, for me to be good at work, first I need 2 cups of concentration, 1 cup of, it's like, I don't know, it's really, really stupid to me. And then my thing is like, wait a second, all these people like self-help books, and I'm thinking it's stupid as hell. like, am I just making, and you touched on this last week. It's like, am I just making, or was it last week? It was one of the nets. It all blurs together. It's like, am I making my own problem here? Or am I making my own problem just to feel like I'm in the position of correctness? Or am I actually seeing something that a lot of people aren't getting? And that's why there's like a constant repeat to self-help books. But then when I think to myself, oh, the person who constantly reads self-help books, oh wait, that sounds familiar. I'm constantly reading philosophy. Like, what is going on? So to me, the real difference, philosophy is self-help book, but of the essence itself, so to speak, versus it touching on the essence via like a 50-foot long pole. Like you like poke it, and like the ripple effect is like what the philosophy, the self-help book is teaching. In my mind, with regard to like the fear question, I think you have to have some understanding to know that you're scared, to know that you have fear. And I think if self-help books don't provoke your ability to ask a question and answer your own question, i.e., to understand, then you're not actually addressing what you're addressing from conquering a fear. You're just, it's still submerged, so to speak, under the igloo. Um or the iceberg, not the igloo. But yeah, I just think that uh the only way to actually help yourself is to understand, and the only way to understand is to take the philosophical journey. And once you take that philosophical journey, then you're willing to be like, all right, I don't understand this, and now I'm scared. And like if you don't get to that point, then it's like you're literally living in a matrix of bullshit. And things constantly seem similar. Like, oh, all my problems are like similar, and I seem like I can't escape it. I mean, I'll speak for myself. I constantly have problems, but they are so new. Like, I just got myself a puppy. I didn't think I like it was. I've all these problems that I was not like. If you asked me a month ago, or a month and a half ago, I did not anticipate I would have these problems in my life. And yet the reason why I got a puppy in my mind is because I've wanted a puppy, and the timing with like emotional turmoil with family and whatever, it just made sense. And I just acted. And like the ability to do that action is because I'm like thinking about my life in such a philosophical way where it's like, this feels like the right decision to make. And with that new decision comes a new set of problems that are so different than other previous sets of problems. And yeah, I can say more, but I'll pass off to someone. I'm burning up in this car. I got to get out.
Because you're so hot. Ah, hey Sam, it is good to see you. And I have this song now of I have 99 problems and a puppy is now one of them. So I have 100. Oh wait, 300. I have 300 problems. Oh gosh. So that is grand. I'm also, it's like a chicken or egg thing. What comes first? Facing the fear or understanding something as a fear? So is it understanding or is the facing? Because that's kind of interesting. Like we were actually just kind of talking earlier. We talk, at the Ivan Illich class, like how do you tell the difference between wisdom and fear? Like something that's wise not to do versus something you're afraid to do. In religious language, it might be what's the difference between anxious fear and reverential fear? Huh? Don't you need understanding to tell that difference? Well, then what if you use getting understanding to avoid facing the fear? What kind of understanding, right? So that's a really interesting chicken and egg problem. I will pass it to Emilio, Michelle, and then Clayton. And I'm also kind of thinking it's very interesting. I think what you're saying is like there's a real sense in which a lot of self-help assumes a background, but you actually have to get to the origin to really help yourself. And at that point, the self is dissolved. So it's just help, I guess, help, or something, right? So there's this idea of having to get to the origin. But then, of course, because it is interesting, and then it's like, well, the only way to help yourself is to die well. If you can't die well, you weren't doing much help. well, that sounds weird. It also seems to be an issue of like a lot of self-help or whatever is let me solve your problems versus the person saying, let me die with you. Like there's something about the philosophical text is like, hey, I'm going to come die. You want to come die? I'm going to die with you. Or these are the things that you can do that are going to make you have a good death. Now, it depends on what you're talking about. But it's almost like Cadell and Jacob just had a great talk on the problem with sex positivity that doesn't acknowledge the negativity, not because sex is bad, but it always brings tension. Maybe the issue is that it's too much positive self-help in this, if we're using the phrase self, or versus this kind of self-help without any negativity, maybe. And that's what happens when you get to the origin. Maybe it's also self-help expecting a result versus help self that has a risk of being pointless because there's no guarantee that it will actually lead to anything. There are all these, because it's really interesting to ask, there seems to be a dangerous, toxic, therapeutic zeitgeist, right? But then it also seems to be erroneous to say that there's no such thing as improvement at all, right? So, or character. How do you thread that needle? And what does that even look like? That's what's interesting. And I like this question of understanding or fear first, but I will pass it over to Sam, we came up with a song. Last friends. I'm going to do that about 20 times. I told everyone at the start. So when I actually do it 20 times, you'll be like, frick, he told the truth. But let me pass it to Emilio and then Michelle and Clayton. So Emilio, it is good to see you.
Hello, wonderful to be back and to see you all. I love the song, by the way. It's a really good song. I wish I had it on Spotify. Yeah. But and what I was thinking about, like with these like self-help books, is that like I think most books are soggy, or like they are not specific, they are not useful, they are like, and especially with self-help books, right? Because I I think that it's like most people say with more words what they can say in less, right? You have a book that could be an article, a paragraph that could be a sentence, right? So like most, like if you read um and this is something like new, that when you have your and something new for me is that once you have an idea, how do you make it actionable? And I think it's interesting because you can have like a different worldview. Like an idea can change the way you view the world, and that in itself changes the way you act. But also you can have like an idea that specifically changes something, right? Because if you're like, I read this book, right? Let's say you're struggling at work or with your friends or family or partner or something, and you read this book, right? And you're like, this is going to be like the thing. And then you finish it, and then your life is the same way, right? Like you didn't change your actions, you didn't change the way you think. But like, and I think that maybe in that sense, like it can be like something of like of solace, as that you can feel like a little bit calm while you read the book, because you feel like you're actually changing something, like a little bit of relief in the time of storm. So that may be useful in itself, even if it's not useful anywhere else. But I think that if a book or something or an idea, right, doesn't make you change your actions in some way, or doesn't change your worldview, it didn't really click, you didn't understand it, or what the idea wasn't really useful, right? Because you could say like, if you want to feel better, like feel better, right? And you're like most self-help books are like that, but like 100 pages long, right? Like that's why I came here, right? So that it's not a good thing to like. Yeah, I think most of the books are that way, and I think that also because like self-help books are like soft, in the sense that like everything's going to be okay, you're going to be fine, and like no, everything's not fine, everything's not okay. That's why I am here, but you're telling me like relax, like a lot of positivity without the negative, right? And I think like sometimes when you're having a hard situation, it's better when people like tell it to you like straight and hard, like this is going to be this is going to suck, it's going to suck like for like 6 months, 1 year, unless you change this, right? And it's not like happy butterflies, this is going to suck and it's going to hurt, and that sometimes is more useful. I remember I read on high school like the subtle art of not giving a fuck, and one like most, yeah, and one of the ideas that really stuck out to me is that when you like, the experience of accepting you feel bad is good, right? Like if you accept like I feel bad, that brings like a little bit of peace. But if you want like to be better and you feel like that feels bad, right? So it's like this juxtaposition. When you accept like, oh, okay, this is a bad situation, suddenly like you feel like a weight of your shoulders, right? Which is like opposite of how like most self-help books um go. Yeah, and just so that's like self-help books and ideas, and I think the ideas have to be actionable for them to make you like have a change. And just in on the courage thing, right? That you have to be like brave to do these sort of things. I think it's interesting because like for, I don't know, when you like we're afraid of how other people will perceive us in a way, like, right? So that's why we don't like do the like the new things that may be good for us. But I think this is like a weird crux because in a sense like preconceptions of ourselves are like actually impactful, right? If I go to for a job and like they like don't even give me the time of day, like that's going to be bad for me. Or if I go to someone to become a friend and they look at me like funny or like mean or something because they believe I'm this or that, that's going to affect my life in a real tangible way, right? So in a way it's really important how people perceive you, but at the same time it's like if you have the courage to be like to be I don't know, to do things that you believe are worth it even if people will look at them as funny. I think that's even if it goes bad, I think that's really useful for a like internal character perspective. But the funny thing is, most of the time it goes well. Like just as a quick example, in in high school, I wanted to learn how to handstand. So I just like in a patch of grass on my school, I started to handstand, and people would go by and say like, "What are you doing?" Right? Because it's like weird. Like I'm falling constantly falling down because I'm trying to and it's not working. And I was like, "Yeah, I'm trying to handstand," and people were like, okay, weird. But the thing is, like, I invited them, like, just like, oh, do you want to try? It's like, it's fun and stuff. So, like, most people said no, but a couple said yes, and some of them actually did it. So you transform this weird thing that you like people like to something that actually makes you that benefits you in this with other people, right? So that's like it not always happens, but most of the time, this paradox gets resolved that if you have the courage to do the thing that you think people will judge you on, it actually ends up being fine most of the time, right? Like exception stuff. So I think that's interesting, but yeah, ideas, books, and courage. And yeah.
Outstanding. And I love that idea of doing something odd and then inviting the people in and being a permissionary, and that's magnificent. Second, Mr. Jockin, is good to see you. I certainly enjoyed our conversation the other day. And everyone in Georgia, go to Jockin's event. Go to his event tomorrow. It's coming up. It's gonna be on beauty. It's gonna be grand. So that's outstanding. Mr. Jockin, I can't friends of mine. Yeah, that's what it is. That's our theme song. Also, it is interesting. Most self-help books do fit. So what we're talking about, Jockin, is this idea that there is clearly a form of like toxic therapy self-help that's really bad. But then it also seems like there is such thing as improvement. So how do we kind of sort these kind of differences? Also, Phillip is literally skiing while on this net conversation. I saw the camera. He literally was going down a hill. I tried skiing once and couldn't even stop. I have this image of that Yeti from the Ski Free Windows game grabbing like Phillip and trying to eat him, and Phillip punching it in the face until that little two-dimensional Yeti from Ski Free dies. So Phillip, good to see you, sir. But yeah, like
Hey,
most,
it's a little weird, but I would encourage everyone to try it.
handstand. Let's all straight up handstand, actually. That's what we need to do. It's gonna be great. Bam. Yeah, it does feel like most self-help books say something like, get a lot of money, don't get sick, and have unlimited time. Oh, okay, great. That's nice. You know, and it's interesting because it does seem like often life, kind of general, it's like you have the categories of money, health, and time. Like you have to do well in those three areas, but they require trade-offs between those three. And if you make a lot of money, but you lose your health, who cares? If you have great health and a lot of money, but you have no time, who cares? If you have a lot of time, but you don't have any health and money, that's not too good. So, you know, it's like you need all three. But the other thing I wonder sometimes is I sometimes wonder like philosophy that helps you get to the origin and to kind of work with the negativity there to improve based on. Maybe if you do that, I do wonder sometimes if actually philosophy helps you get the good out of otherwise crappy self-help books. It's almost like you can go back and get the nuggets out of like a meaning, I'm thinking of a Norman Peale or like some of the Daniel Pink stuff. It's almost like you're able to get the nuggets and it not get in the way of your relationship with your origin, to use that language that Luba was kind of saying, the Heidegger, of getting down to kind of base reality. Whereas otherwise, you read the book and you absorb the background that tends to be maybe a hustle culture. And so you're not able to take, like, what ends up happening is if you can't do philosophy, you can't read those books. It seems more natural to read those books and also absorb the culture that comes with them, as opposed to maybe if you can do it on the philosophical base, you can get the nuggets and not be pulled into the overall worldview. I'm not sure. It was just a thought that came to mind, but I will pass it to Michelle Clayton and then Chetan. Michelle.
Yeah, just a really quick comment. Loving what everybody's sharing, and I will hold you to the 20 times, Daniel, on the song. I was thinking about just the idea of like facing fears and like, because I remember talking to Daniel right after the net last week of like about how does facing one's fears have to do with like friendship? Like how does that, what exactly is that relationship? I'd be curious to hear from other people, but I mean, Emilio, it was kind of neat how you shared that about like inviting other people into doing something different, right? I think that to me, well, I can think about it just like in terms of like my friendship with Daniel, which because there is friendship in marriage, of course, there should be. Hopefully there is. But being able to, you will not have a more cultivated like friendship if you're not willing to face your fears, like open your mouth, talk to the person about things that you're processing, And so, yeah, I guess that's one example I can think of for like how facing one's fears and friendship feed into one another, Maybe another thing is that sometimes like my understanding of friendship has really expanded or changed and deepened in many ways over the years, but sometimes for much of like our well, I'll just say sometimes like beyond my twin sister has that like real depth, obviously, because we were like one person at one time. We're identical twins, so we're very close and talk about dreams and all sorts of stuff like that. But a lot of times friendships come out of a fear, like, well, if I don't have friends, I'm a loner. Like, so you end up having friends that I wouldn't say are like the friendship of like the friendship of that we talk about, where it's that ability to kind of really grow in the difference in that space of the depth and the conversation, and you can do the doing things too, but really like what sustains it all is like it's mediated by language, right? So I think it is very much related, because I don't know if really I understood what really what true I would say true friendship, or what this other type of friendship is really like, until I started to, like, you really kind of get into it because you're sort of facing fears. You're doing the stuff that nobody understands. You're living in a way that nobody really understands or thinks is the right way, or you're not making the most of your potential, blah, 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 blah. All those things, which I'm not trying to dismiss those concerns, but it's like you, a lot of times before that, it's just having friends out of your situation. As my classmate, so we're buddies. And I'm not saying that's like, there's no place to that. There is a place for that, but it can come from fear. And I remember feeling that fear. This is just a silly example, but I would feel that fear with even having a friend over. Because I'm like, well, are they gonna have a good time? I don't know if they're gonna like the time that we're gonna have, and what are we gonna do? And like, are they gonna like that I'm gonna suggest doing makeovers and massages? But just stuff like that. Like I was concerned that they'd have a good time. And I remember my mom saying, like, they're not here for that stuff. They're here for you. Like, they're here to be with you, and you're having them over to be with them. But it's, when it's not mediated by language or understanding that depth, it can be like it's hard for it not to feel kind of superficial and then fall into potential drama in middle school of stuff where people don't even understand what friendship is. And yet if we don't have friends, we feel fearful that we're loners, and we have nobody. And this kind of relates, Sam, you wrote an incredibly beautiful piece on Substack, another incredibly beautiful piece about loneliness and solitude and the interior of ourselves. And I think what I see, even though I'm not sure it's relatable for every person, is this being a space of like actually even though it's never going to be completely that somebody else can feel my own interiority, that's the whole point of it, but to at least kind of be willing to kind of open up that interiority for others to sort of come and inhabit with us in that. So yeah, that's what I think of friendship in this other sense of the word. But I think it does rely on facing fears, because it's scary to talk and to share, or to even say, like, I'm thinking about this, or I don't know if I agree with that, or I'm not sure, I'm kind of dealing with this thing, and really allowing that space for the person to hear you and maybe misunderstand you, but still at least give it a try, So yeah, anyways, that was my little thing I wanted to say.
I mean, Michelle, there is no way that you could have friends over and they'd be bored now that you have the friend song. Friends, 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 friends. I mean, they'll always have a good time. So, Jacob, we were talking about last time how at the net, like, it's good to see.
It's really funny you say that. Sorry, it's really funny you say that, because one of my activities, I'd pick things to do, like to offer the friends who would come over. Like, one of the things was listen to cool radio stations. I was like, they're gonna have a good time. There's no way they're gonna hate the time over if we get to listen to a station.
And then when they say yes, Michelle turns around and she has FM on her back. She's like, great, the radio station is here. I've got FM on my back. Oh yeah, friends. I got 10 more. So no, it's wonderful everything you said. I do wonder. And everyone, Jacob had a tremendous conversation with Cadell, and I think it's relevant because we're talking about this toxic therapeutic culture that's very bad, but then it seems wrong to say that there's no such thing as a good kind of form of improvement. What's the difference? It makes me think that you were saying with Cadell on, like, by not acknowledging the negativity in sex, not that sex is bad, but that there is a negativity that comes out in relationships that you have to work through. Then people get overwhelmed, they're not ready, and there are all these problems. So you have to face the negativity. And it seems like you almost have this kind of negativity that needs to be faced in works of improvement, that if you don't, then it becomes this kind of toxic therapeutic structure or something. And that seems to be relevant for friendship. I do wonder if there's, I do think there's always, I always go to the Dante model, and I'll give it to Clayton and Cheaton, where, in hell, in Inferno, the logic is moral or not, yes or no. Did you do the right thing or not? But as you move toward the Paradiso, it's not so much good, bad, it's rate of unveiling the good so that you can handle it and you are not destroyed by it. There's like a different logic that has to be brought as you move toward joy. And I wonder if there's something about friendship like that. Like when you're younger, it's okay that your friends are actually more set by the situation, that they're it's not like actually a bad thing. But as you get older and there's a certain developmentalism, there's something that is required about the friendship that is facing courage. Maybe the friendships have to be pointless. I do wonder sometimes, I was going to bring this up, like I want to, I do wonder sometimes, I mentioned with Jockin, I do wonder sometimes if it's easier to overcome a fear of death than it is to overcome a fear of doing something pointless, or a fear of doing something that other people think is a waste or you don't have utility, right? And I think like it requires a certain courage to do something that is an end in itself, right? Like we always say, hey, people are supposed to be ends in themselves. You're supposed to enjoy friendship for its own sake. And we all go, absolutely, as we proceed not to do that. Like that, like, oh, you're supposed to read literature and appreciate books for their own self because it's good to do. Absolutely, as we proceed to never read. Like, so there's something about courage. Like if we're going to talk all day long about things being an end of itself, and it does seem as you get older, there's something about that becoming more central in your life. You should, there's almost something, I'd have to think about this. There's almost something about maturity or wisdom that is gaining the ability to do more things that are ends in themselves, which is fundamentally courageous and fundamentally difficult because they're naked. You can't really explain them. You have to do them to get in. People are going to think you're dumb. Why are you even doing it, right? So there's a kind of courage. I was speaking with Clayton about that. And so I wonder if that's part of it, where friendships as you get older need to not be incidental, but chosen, and therefore chosen for their own sake, which has a courage to it. And maybe the problem is a lot of self-help doesn't move to that. Like it helps you in getting better at things that the society sees has a point, but it may not help you at being able to choose something that doesn't have a point, that isn't an end in its own right. And that's where you start getting to the origin, because an origin is a birth of points, not a point in of itself per se. It's a birth of a situation, not reductionist. But I was speaking to Clayton about that the other day, because he has a wonderful podcast called Live Quality that everyone should jump on, Mr. Clayton. So let me pass it to Clayton and Cheat Time. Clayton, it is good to see you, my friend.
Good to be here. Like I said, we're turning this into a church, and now we have a hymn. So it's happening. The religion that's not a religion. Anyway, yeah, self-help and friendship and everything. It's like what everybody said, I am in complete agreement with. And the other thing that is also still standing out for me while I'm hearing all this is, well, it reminded me of, I only started to listen because I can't really find enough time to sit down and hold a book and read it. So I'm listening to John Milton's Paradise Lost. And at the beginning of book 4, he tries to lay out the preamble of what happens in the Garden of Eden. And in there, there's the part where, God articulates to these new creatures that he's made, the humans, not to eat from the tree of knowledge of, I think, knowledge of good and evil. But that really stuck out for me because it's like the injunction to, it's like eating from the tree of knowledge is kind of like, yeah, they say the penalty for that, like what will happen is you die. But I think it's more like you will lose sensitivity to follow the spirit of experience, or the theme of the spirit of experience that's unfolding right before you. And because knowledge is just a snapshot, it's like a tiny snapshot of what that experience should be. And so you have to reanimate that experience. And I guess that speaks a lot to why we're so, taken up by moving images, I would even say. And so, because we do, like, the moving image is sort of like, it has a spirit in it. It's moving. It's not just static. But I think the self-help is a snapshot. It's a snapshot of a helpful experience that somebody had and they would like to share. But it's so difficult to capture and bottle up that we try to do that in the self-help books. And it's like, here's the experience. Please go consume it, because we have the having versus being mode. But we're trying to have the experience so that we can keep it for ourselves and consume of it. But actually, I think the task we have is to do the work to take the snapshot of this experience and re-inject life in it so we can reanimate it and then extend our experience with that snapshot of that experience so that we can have our experience or our subjectivity rearranged. Because it's all about that rearrangement of the subjectivity that keeps you at the proper place, which would kind of be the right place to be, which is not clearly defined. And it's only something you can sense, and hence draws you closer to the righteousness. And then you can be where you need to be and be there how you should be there, doing what you need to be doing. So it's sort of like seems to me like it's coming from there. And the motivation for the self-help packaging is probably like an outcry of like sufferings. Like, I can't bear witnessing another's suffering, yet I have been in that situation. So here's a little snapshot that should get them unstuck. However, their experience, if they were really embedded in it, at some point the suffering will unlock how you get unstuck out of it, and then you have now to do the work to get out of it. Kind of like, what Emilio was saying, it's like you have to learn how to do a handstand, and there's a lot of failing to do that. And we were speaking about the failing last time. It's like, yeah, you have to fail so many times before you can actually do the handstand. You look at a child learning to walk. It's like, how many times do they have to fall? Oh, they're gonna have to fall for like 6 months before they can take their first step. But if they knew that, would they even try? I guess that's why it's something they have to learn before they have that cognitive interpretation, because probably they'll just go like, you know what, we'll just become like those people in Wall-E, just sit down on a big blob and just go everywhere. Yeah, but I think that whole, it's like we have to contend with that static aspect of experience that, like oh, where the balloons, sorry. Yeah, so it's like we have to contend with that static experience, which sort of like takes the animation out of the experience. So we have to work towards following that spirit of experience. And you'll see this, like, sorry, I don't have good references, but I only have like, I've been watching a lot of, children's movies. So you see at the end of the Lego movie, the father and son have this big debate about whether to super glue the Lego city that they've built or not. And the son's point is that, look, if you super glue the city, then it loses life. Like it's a living city, but the father is doing this one architecture project, and things have to be static. And so it's like that contention between these two worldviews, and the whole movie is really about that, at least for me. But if you ask my children, they'll probably tell you something different. And it's that contention. It's like you have to you have to look beyond what you see, like Mufasa would say, right? Like look beyond what you see, so that you can see the depth of that experience and find a way into it, as opposed to being stuck on the on the static version, on the snapshot of it that is sort of like not all of it. And so it's like it's like the snapshot is an invitation. So yeah, those things really stood out to me, and I'll pass it back. Thank you.
First off, I just watch children's movies for fun. So, I guess you're supposed to have children when you watch them, but truth is, and actually you've brought out the deep philosophical truth of the Lego movie that I will always now see in light of Paradise Lost by Mr. Milton. I really appreciate that. That is really like wonderful. The only problem with the Lego movie is that that's pretty big competition with the Everything is Awesome song, because the friends is gonna beat it at the billboards. So Matthew Stanley last week, it's good to see you, my friend. Everyone should pick up Ideology and Christian Freedom. It's well written, in this presentation at Philosophy Portal was outstanding. And last week we talked about how the net, at the end of the day, the ultimate thing is friendship, the ability to do something for its own sake, but that takes a certain kind of courage. So now we have a theme song called Friends. I have 8 more. You were talking about handstands, having to do it 100 times. I need to do this song 8 more times, and then I'll be ready for Led Zeppelin 2. Amashazi, Yuki. Oh yeah, we're ready. I'm really taken also by what you were saying about the static, super glue, and different things. I know Javier, wherever he is right now, is looking up and saying, I think it's the Merton quote, where he's like, the irony is that they actually knew good, but they didn't know they good. They wanted to know that they knew good, so they ate from the tree. So there's a certain kind of irony of, trying to get what you already have, which is a fundamentally privational act, right? But it's also interesting because as you were talking, I'd have to defend this actually. It's interesting because it's like the tree of knowledge is consuming, where the works that they have are more like naming the animals or taking care of the gardens. It's interesting how there's this emphasis on a consumption as being sort of what leads to toil or what's problematic. And there's something, when you consume something, there's a sense in which you make it static, right? It's no longer in life, it's in you. Now it's in your energy system, so I don't want to push that too much. But it's very interesting on this kind of stagnancy that's created, and the idea of self-help being, oh, I'll consume this. Definitely some of the self-help language is almost medicated. Once I read this book, I'll take the medicine, I'll be better, right? Whereas when we talk about this improvement of philosophy, there's almost like that you always have to wrestle with it. There's no medication, there's no one and done easy button or something like that. So that kind of points at a distinction. And I like the idea of the knowledge of good and evil. It's like, oh, you don't have to experience it, you can just know it. Maybe that's part of it. It's like, instead of having to experience good and evil, or different things, you can consume it and be done with it. It's like, no, the desire to not experience is therefore what leads to trouble. And maybe that's the issue. Maybe some self-help is like, if you read this book, you won't have to experience bad things. And maybe that's the problem, because like, you'll know the bad, so it won't happen. So it's almost like maybe that's part of the issue. I'll have to think about that. But let me pass it to Cheeton, Emilio, and Sam. Cheeton, it's good to see you, friend. 7 more. All right, Cheeton.
Yeah, it's a really interesting conversation, because actually, my father was in sales a long time back, and he used to buy a lot of self-help books. And I started reading very early from self-help books in that sense. And some of them have really interesting conversations going on. Let's not be, I think, dishonest about it. If we really read through what's coming out in those spaces, it is. But what interests me in self-help books generally has been that for some reason we know that they have been forced back into philosophy. Almost all of those ideas have been there in some form in the history of philosophy, and yet they never go back to them. There is something which has cut it from its own origin, which is interesting to put it. That so many people who are making so much money out of these books don't care to actually go back and take part in the philosophical conversation. Why is that? When they can benefit so much from it. That's, I think, the first, one question that we should ask ourselves. I think the second is, when we talk about this question of improvement. Improvement is a very interesting problem, because if we ask the question, what is the criteria for something improving? I don't think we'll have an easy answer. I think there was a very old Buddhist story that, a person came into the village and he said, we'll take your son to the army. And one of the sons was, fell from a horse, and we said, this is bad or good. And you say, wait. And the story keeps on changing in that sense that, everything, something good happened, something bad emerged from it, something bad happened, something good emerged from it, in that sense. So one doesn't know, how do we classify something as improved? Either, and there is no easy answer out of it without still saying everything is an improvement. Any effort is an improvement, because the criteria for setting what is improvement and what is not is a difficult. We can get into, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's a very difficult problem to crack in that sense. And because it's a difficult problem to crack, what generally happens is that disciplines, fields, social communities get organized in a manner where we already need some pre-given forms of indicators from which improvement can be judged. You need some pre-given indicators from which that can happen. And one of the things, philosophy being one of the many other things, philosophy is interesting because it's one of the longest conversations we have. To actually, entering into philosophical discussion is to enter into conversation which has been happening for thousands of years. And usually you have to wait for a long time before you can start speaking it as people. And there is a fundamental crack or a difference, I think, between the time in which philosophy is operating today and time in which capitalism is operating. The times don't match for whatever reasons. And I think self-help books in that way is a symptom. It's a symptom of trying to articulate this question of self in the capitalist time. Because capitalist time doesn't allow self to emerge. It always has to emerge in some supplementary way. It's a very hard effort for self to find some kind of anchoring within that frame of time, which is why one can very clearly see that people who are making a lot of money, you can look at people like Elon Musk. All these people actually want to have a claim over philosophy. They want to have a claim over that conversation which they are not part of. And yet they cannot have the patience or the training to go back and read the conversation or in some sense be in the time frame in which the conversation is happening. And people, those who are taking part in those conversations, are actually cut out from the capitalist market flow. the conversations in which self-help book is taking place, or Elon Musk is talking, or Mark Zuckerberg is talking, primarily simply from the fact that they're not operating in the same time space. They are not operating from the same location. And thus they cannot, and this used to happen to me in a lot of job interviews. I used to go to a job interview and I used to try and show to them that what I know, I don't know from philosophy books. So the minute the employer will know that I'm reading philosophy, he'll know I'm not good for his position. So I have to fit in. I know something, but I do not know it from reading those books, because if he sees that me reading those books, he knows that I won't be good for him. Because the amount of time I'm taking to read and think about those things, that timeline will not fit with this outcome. And how do we think through this fundamental contradiction that has actually cornered and blocked philosophical conversation to seep into other forms of life? And that's the problem I think we are facing. I have something to say on friendship also. Maybe I'll come back, and I may just go and sleep also in the next 15-20 minutes. So I'm sorry. Thank you so much.
You rock, Chetan, and if you go to sleep in the middle of the morning, night, it's completely reasonable. I really, really love what you said. I really like this idea of kind of like, yeah, in all the self-help books, they kind of like have the ideas that have always been found in philosophy. So it's like they're stealing them, but not acknowledging the origin, which makes me think of Luber's point. So the self-help books will not look at the philosophers and go, friends, friends, friends. Instead, they'll say, I don't know you. I don't know you. So there's no friend song between those. I have 6 more. And I think it's interesting too, because as you were talking, it's almost like that point you made that if they find out you read philosophy, I have this image of Teton. They're like, what's in your pocket? Nothing. What's in your pocket? It's a Plato dialogue. Get out. You make me sick. They throw you out. So that's a great image. It actually reminds me though, so because it's like you're in a different flow of time, but it's almost like it's like capitalism, the flow of capital, the time that markets operate doesn't have time for philosophy, but they still need the advice from philosophy. So how do we get the nuggets in a more compact form without taking on the mode of being that comes with philosophy? So you get these kind of nuggets, but then of course the problem is the nuggets actually don't flesh out the case, because if they did, the philosophers would have not written as much as they did. They would have just given you those nuggets. And what's interesting is as you were talking, I'm now kind of wondering if self-help books are to philosophy what often sermons are to theology in churches. Like this experience of these sermons, like they're leaving out so much. You have to go into theology, but if you like bring Augustine to church, you're like, why are you reading that? It's like, I'm sorry. Like there's a similar sort of, you're not supposed to be in the time of reading theology because that's taking you away maybe from the commission or taking you away from the community. There's a certain sort of like, you're outside the flow of time that is religious life if you're reading theology. You're supposed to just take the sermons, but of course, like the sermons leave a lot open. And if you could just take the sermons, Augustine or Aquinas or whoever wouldn't have written these texts. So it's interesting because now it's like, I'm thinking of the self-help to philosophy relation, like the sermon to theology relation in different ways. And it seems like it does have a kind of sense of flow, like the time, like in how you live your life. So that's very interesting. So I'm very glad to be in a flow of the net to where we can talk about philosophy and be in a different kind of form of time. And so it's really great that we're all friends. I'm going to give it to Emilio and then Sam. That was my worst one. That one doesn't even count. I really shrieked there. Okay, Chetan.
I'll just say one thing. I can't believe I'm quoting Kate Brothers over here, but it almost fits. One of them actually said it in one of those interviews that a well-played game of chess is a sign of a thinking mind, but a great played game of chess is a wasted life. It's a sign of a wasted life. It's almost the same thing with philosophy. A reading of self-help books is a sign that you're thinking and you participate. And it's a really well-played, a really well-read person in philosophy is wasted for the capitalist market in that sense. Yeah.
And you know, it makes me feel so good that because I'm just a world-class chess master and we're defending pointlessness, so I feel so good right now. Actually, I'm at the point where I think Haven beats the crap out of me, so it's really terrible. So it's quite lovely. But let me pass it to him. But no, it's very funny, right? It's like, isn't that funny? I think about chess a lot, actually, because it is an interesting example of great genius, and there's something magnificent about it, but it's also pointless, and yet it's great because it's pointless, because it takes a certain courage to do. It's kind of interesting how arts have a certain quality like that. So that's an interesting thing to bring in. I will pass it to Emilio and then Sam. Emilio.
What you said about like nuggets, like you want the nuggets without the work to get them. I think it's because you don't have the context, right? Like I could tell you a sentence, right? And I think that like some books are not worth it, right? They don't say anything, but some books you read the whole book just to be able to understand one sentence, right? One idea, but you need the whole context, the whole examples, the whole journey you went through to understand what that sentence means, because like of course that sentence will there's like some words together and people will hear it without the context, won't be able to unlock the full power of the idea, right? And I think it's interesting because books are hashes in the sense that, for example, like in blockchain, you have like this, like a lot of compute. I'm going to explain it really crudely, but like you have a lot of compute power to come up with the number that will be like the next one in the sequence, right? But once you have the number, you don't have to do the previous work. You just validate like the number, like you place it in an equation and it gives you the result, right? So like in a way, for me, like getting to that point is like reading the book, but now you have the hash, right? So you can just reference the idea quickly. So like you have to go through the whole process to like have the nuggets of the ideas make sense, to have the capsule idea, to have the idea, and you can just the whole book can be not broken down, but like you can explain the whole book in a single sentence, but to understand that sentence you need the whole book, right? And the whole experience. And I think that's really interesting because it goes both ways. Like you cannot have like the easy way, you have to read the book, but at the same time, when you've read the book, like now you know what that sentence means. You can have the idea and clash it with other ones, and you have like this quick and easy access to come up with new ideas because you have hashed the information in your brain to say it in a certain way, right? So I think that's really, really cool. And I think that's cool because once you read the book and you understand it and stuff, you have that idea and you can play with it. And yeah, and just something I think it's interesting with self-help books is that I would argue that for you to do weird things, you have to have a strong sense of self, right? You have to have a strong sense of self. And I think that most people that are like gravitates towards self-help books, they don't have that, and they are trying to, in a way, forge it, right? They are trying to create that sense of self for them because and I read this article once and I really liked it. It was because like a really intelligent programmer that had like a company or something. And he said that in class, like people made fun of him because he asked dumb questions, right? And he was like, because I asked something that's like should be obvious, right? And then my classmates like like made fun of me. But he said like, no, I saw like I made this obvious question because there was something that like I understood that layer deeper, so that like dumb question made sense, right? Like it actually revealed something interesting. And I think that you can only make a dumb question if you know that you're like smart, or that you know that you're not dumb, right? Because if you don't have that sense of self and you make a dumb question, like that what does that mean? That you're dumb, right? Like it's a vote into the character of you not understanding things. But if you perceive yourself as as someone capable or intelligent and stuff, and you do like this dumb question, you like your sense of self is strong enough for you to be able to take that hit, or to interpret it in such a way that it's like beneficial, right? So I think that if you do something weird, you have to have a strong sense of self. So I think that most of the self books fail in that regard because they tell you like the nuggets without the context, and they don't help you feel the sense of self, and that's like where most things go wrong, because I think that's important. Yeah, because you have the courage to do things, and I think that's cool. Yeah.
I love that idea that it takes a certain self and security to ask dumb questions. That's brilliant. And you know, I'm feeling really secure because it also applies to maybe movie watching. I don't need your Lawrence of Arabia or Bergman Persona. I'm watching my Lego movie because there's confidence in that. There is something funny though. Like I'm now thinking like they're like Zizek or whatever. A lot of these philosophers, they don't mind like referencing Disney or all these different people. Like they don't care. They're gonna look everywhere. And now I'm kind of wondering. It is interesting how kind of almost in academia, sometimes in academia, there's almost like we only reference other academics. And now maybe that's kind of suggesting a certain insecurity that's actually lurking. So I really like that point. That's making me think. Also, on the point that you were saying about context and not knowing the whole and the points are different things, man, Mr. Jockin the other day was telling me that in Islam, they got that hacked with the 99 names of God. Man, you don't know the context. They know it's like, oh, that's what you think the gatherer means? Okay, buddy. All right, we know. So that's brilliant. Really like that. And I also am thinking about, yeah, like, because a lot of the great books, if you were to say, well, give me the Nuggets of Ulysses by James Joyce. The Nuggets. Yeah, man, give me the Nuggets. It's like, no, you have to read it. It is the thing. It is an emotional experience that can go by no other name or no other terminology or no other wording. I do also, and then I'll give it to Sam, I do wonder too if there's something about self-help, like if it has a kind of social ideological function in the sense you can say, well, I'm reading self-help, so I'm humble. I'm reading self-help, so I'm humble, but I'm also being productive because I'm trying to get better at my job. But if you were reading philosophy, then you're outside the realm of time. But self-help, you're still in the flow of time, like Chetan was saying, and it has a kind of like you're humble and you're trying to get better. So I also wonder if it's a kind of, and also it gives the feeling of being interested in philosophy. Oh, wow, they're interested in the bigger questions, right? So it's almost like maybe there's a kind of ideological structure. Now, it depends on what self-help books you're reading or stuff like that. Like How to Break into a Bank probably is not going to get you to Marcus Aurelius. But there's something like there's an ideological function there, I wonder, as well, that we don't worry about here because we're friends. That one was better. I didn't have the break. Let me give it to Sam and Chetan. Sam, it is good to see you. I hope you are well.
Hi, friends. Oh, okay. So just to like carry on with that conversation, I do think a lot about why I read because I don't remember half of it and it's a lot of time. And I think like the best answer that I've kind of made for myself is like sort of also related to this conversation in that I think what it does is it's an attentional process that does sort of like carve me out a little bit further each book I read, and I get a little bit more spacious, my interior. And if you think about like if you've ever lived in like a really tiny apartment versus just like a really like like say I don't know if you've had like friends with like an old loft or something, or like like different houses are different sizes, but you can do different things in different spaces, like to have more spaciousness. I mean, even just going to a library with ceiling height, like it's different reading under a high ceiling height. It can't tell me that it isn't. And so yeah, I think like there's a certain just like I don't know what to call it other than an attentional process that I think sort of like creates that space inside of us. And then once that space is there, it's like who's able to see into it, and that sort of relates to what Michelle and Clayton were talking to, and I wanted to bring up just a thing that came to me recently in relation to like Clayton, what you had said about being in the right place and at the right time, and Michelle, what you were talking about friendship. I had a falling out with a friend recently, and I think the kind of issues that we've been discussing about like about friendship were very much at play. And I think what I kind of realized was like I have been like when you're a kid and you have like these very circumstance-oriented friendships, like we went to the same high school together. You build these friendships, and then like in the interim, like 15 years, we have both been doing things to like we've both been living our life, and our life has been like molding us and that interior spaciousness. And I think at the point where there was like really an impasse in our friendship, I realized that like I had been doing a lot of work to like create a sense of self wherein like I'm able to see the world with hope, and like just fundamentally, just as a self-help practice, like that's what gets me through. And I think that relates sort of to like the gap between, yes, there is progress in character development, but it's not necessarily like linear or cumulative. But at any rate, what I realized in my conflict with this person is that like I think the like spaciousness that I had become, which allows me a perspective upon the world wherein I can be hopeful. When she saw through the world through me, through our friendship, it wasn't hopeful for her. And like I think I had done like I think there just was a conflict where like the things that I did to try and help her, she resented me. And like and I think it was just like, oh, there's a place to be, and there's a right place to be, there's right relationships to be had, and like maybe this just isn't one of them. And like I can still just love her anyways, but it's like perhaps like a distance needs to be created. And like I think those kind of complexities sort of like they speak to the non-accumulative, non-linearity of self-development progress, because it's hard to reduce a situation like that down to like, this was good, this was bad. It just like, it was an impasse, it was a change. Yeah, and I think like, I mean, there's a lot like built into the word change. And I think that perspective on changes in my life sort of point towards from self-help, which tends to just be a bit of a mechanical process, towards philosophy, where you need to like a broader like scoping of how to evaluate these situations. And maybe that's broader in the sense of like time and having these long conversations with authors. And maybe it's broader in the sense of just like agency, like where is it my place to do things, and where is it just the world's agents, like, you know, brought other agencies, you know, who have authority there. Anyways, that's what I was thinking about today.
Magnificent, absolutely magnificent. And I echo Michelle's point earlier. When Sam releases a Substack, it's like an event. They should have like parades in the street because they're gorgeous and very insightful, and they feel like a space you're entering. I really like that language. Where when you're reading, you're creating a kind of interior space. Like books have different architecture. That's really profound, because it does seem like when we're asking, does friendship have a point? Because that was something that came up last time. Does philosophy have a point? It does seem like it's more like, no, it's pointless because it's a space in a sense. It's like a situation. Now, situations entail points, but they're not reducible to just points. There's something more that's going on. It's like something you enter. And it is interesting because following like a William Ong, and I know Dr. Anton was saying like in a oral tradition, they don't really have an interior space. What they feel, they express more so, that they say, right? So reading brings it with an interiority, which makes possible depth. But depth could be deeper joy or deeper pain, or depth that makes you more different from people you've always known because you have different depths. So there are different social dynamics that seem to be captured in a language of different spaces, different situations, more geometrical language, versus that have different time horizons versus points. Because like you were just saying, it seems like, you know, Bergson on sequence versus duration. There's something there. A lot of kind of the self-help is more sequence and linear. And I like this idea that Jack and I were talking the other day just about wisdom and different time horizons, on this kind of idea that philosophy, the way that it improvement that is truly improvement, cannot be brought down to a clear sequential pattern. But it kind of occurs. The way I would describe that is the difference between instructions to build something versus when you have one of those paintings, it's a bunch of small ones, but if you stand in the right place, suddenly you see the big one and it's all there. I feel like a lot of times the deeper kind of improvement, like self-help is instructions, which have a role. Like there are things in your life you need like linear instructions to do. But then when you move to this improvement, it's more like knowing you need to walk around to see something you don't know is there, but you know it is there, like a non-relation, as Chetan was saying at Lacan the other day, that then you see it and then you kind of realize it. And that also, to your point, makes me think of Dante, because in Dante, it's like, at what point is he able to handle more of Beatrice's smile? Doesn't seem to be sequential, but there's some sort of development that occurs. And I also think as well, like to Chetan's point, and I'll pass to Chetan and Thomas Jockin, Like, is it an improvement to be able to tell the difference between friends that have gone different ways? In one way, it seems to be an improvement to be able to say we have different interior spaces. And another way, it's like, but you lost a friend, or there's a kind of distancing there, right? It's almost like a part of wisdom in maturity is some sort of sense that the metric of improvement is only known from experience, a knowledge of experience versus a propositional knowledge from a tree that you bite, maybe to allude back to Clayton, right? So you have to engage in this sort of experience. And maturity, if you grant me that term here, is more and more of the realization that your metric for understanding right and wrong is tied to that very space created within you that you have to get. Because the question, like Chetan was saying on improvement, I'm wondering also if, like, is there something about improvement that is the ability to actually ride the waves of oscillations between good and bad? Because at one point your life is good, another point is bad. Is like actual philosophical improvement the ability to ride the wave and the change, maybe the ability to have trust in that interior space? Like the entire metric transforms in profound ways that seem to align. Like, I'm glad you just brought up the time element with duration versus sequence. But let me pass it to Chetan and Thomas Jockin, because everyone here is friends. Chetan.
I just wanted to maybe add to this problem that, my argument in some senses with self-help books isn't that how bad they are in that sense. My argument actually exactly is that no matter how good they are, in many ways they are acting as a supplementary function in that sense, that they are supplementing for something which in some senses is absent from the structure of the conversation that is occurring within that time frame. That time frame in which capitalist movement is taking place doesn't allow subjectivity to emerge, doesn't allow a self to emerge. Self-help book is a desperate attempt for that self to be anchored in. It's a form of conversation in which this supplementary for that lack of self-subjectivity can be held through and anchored through in that sense. And the other side of it becomes this idea that that the development of sense that occurs in philosophy is a wasted life, as I was quoting Tate Brothers. That is what it comes from. That this this emergence of self as it occurs in philosophy doesn't create value for the flow of capital. And that's a real question. We have to be honest about it. We can't create value within the flow of capital through philosophy. It's not an easy job. If we could do that, I'm sure many people would have been reading philosophy by now. There is a fundamental clash of the nature of values that philosophy sets for itself and how capital moves. How do we think through that clash is a problem. But from the other perspective, say from my father's perspective, or from wide entrepreneurial world that we're living in, they are right about it that it's very difficult for them to crack this problem of value via the route of philosophy. They might reach philosophical insights through their own practices, but they won't find. It would be very difficult for me to suggest them to go through the philosophical route to create in that sense. That's, I think, the first. The other, I think, question is question of friendship. Friendship is extremely interesting because friendship, I think, is the other side of ego's capacity to be attached to itself. Any gap between ego's own liberal. So in that sense, friendship always has to hold enmity within itself. It's not a friendship if it doesn't really hold this clash that two egos face when they're brought in relationship to each other. All friendships are a little bit of enmity in that sense, and all worst enemies are a little bit of friends, just to hold their enmity together. Even to say somebody is an enemy demands some kind of friendship underneath that structuring in that sense. And I think one of the difficult things about friendships is to think about what is the nature of relationship. As Aristotle said, that lies underneath all other relationships. For you to be a good mother, you have to be a good friend. You have to be a good father, you have to still be a good friend. To be having lived in a good nation state, you have to be friend to the nation state. That's how Aristotle was sort of thinking. And being on Aristotle, I think Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is the greatest first self-help book written, which we all should read today also. But the challenge with friendship becomes, how do we think about friendship in relationship to this question that ego is fundamentally ambivalent. Ego is fundamentally, in some sense, can attack any other ego that gets too close to it. Friendship is probably the anchoring point through which these relationships within ego can be shared and developed. And what is at stake there?
Outstanding. And I really like it. And it's interesting because there's something about the ego lashing out the other. Is there something about the ability to create a deep internal space or spaciousness that almost when you encounter another ego, because you have a lot of space inside, the ego's far away. So it's not so close that it then fights in a kind of Girardian way, right? Is there something about the interiority that allows the ability to kind of keep egos apart? And if that is so, like we were saying last week, then there might be some profound connection between philosophy or philosophical dialogue or virtue for the cultivation of friendship that is not reducible to utility in some way, which then that to me is tied to the question of how do people handle global pluralism, radical difference and things like that. It would require a vast interiority. But how do we get that if the time of capital does not allow it, right? That seems to be quite a problem there. Matthew brought up a good point. It is interesting, like maybe the words self-help, improvement, maybe none of these words really quite capture it. The word maturity seems to be like good to think, I'll talk about conditionalism and I like those because I like to emphasize, like I was saying, gaining the ability to see that thing that was in front of you your entire life and you didn't even see. And Jock and I were talking about the other day, premiering tomorrow at Friday. So that's like where you condition yourself, and it's just not reducible to a calculus of steps, improvements. It's some sort of bringing yourself to the ability to see something that you didn't see. Beauty, good, like in it, a situation, the interiority, like you're conditioned. And the key to the word for me, conditioning, is like going to the gym, you're conditioning, but also you meet the conditions of seeing life in terms of virtue because you've done the philosophical work or beauty or whatever term you want, right? So maybe there's something about what it is the difference. Maybe it's the difference between therapy and conditioning or therapy and maturity in this sense, like that in the characteristic. Again, if I just go to the Dante model I'm obsessed with, the characteristic of maturity or conditioning is the ability to see more beauty, at that deeper sense that Mr. Jock is going to be teaching on. So there's something very deep there. I really like those points. And I really like, lastly, what the idea of, it's not so much asking the question, are self-help books good or bad? Let's take the good ones. What is the logic of time? What is the character of time of the world today that the self-help book works? I do wonder if it's tied to the notion of the end of history with Francis Fukuyama. Like everything's finished, nothing new can emerge. So you just need to learn the skills to see what's there, which then, of course, gets rid of conditionalism. Conditionalism is all about we actually don't see everything. There's always more depth to have. Whereas it's like, nah, man, we got Washington consensus. We're good. You just need to like memorize it, right? So I wonder if there's something about the end of history notion. Now, it's a little more complicated than that. Francis Fukuyama is not stupid. That he's quite something. But I wonder if there's something in that is part of this kind of notion of time. We don't need a fullness of, we don't need a duration, a kind of developmental time, because we're at the fullness of time. We reach the end of history kind of thing, right? So we don't need any developmental. We just need to learn how to see what's there. And you don't need to read Plato for that. You just need to get the nuggets. Then you'll see what's already there. Whereas if there's some sort of more processional notion, some sort of process, well, there's only one way to get better at that, go through a process yourself. So I really appreciate that point. But let me pass it to Mr. Jockin as we come up. I've got friends, 20-minute friend. So let me pass it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin.
Maybe you need to reconsider your music career options. Maybe you got to think about that for a second. Piano, you're outstanding. Audio, verbal, not so much. Anyways, hope everyone's doing well. I'm really resonating with what Sam's bringing up, and I always appreciate when Sam can join the calls. You know what's You know, it's funny, this idea of self-help, self-improvement, even healing, there's a kind of presupposition of some kind of end or goal, right? There's some kind of reference point of origin that's supposed to be going back to, that there's some kind of deficit or some kind of basically lacking, right? That needs to be moved towards. Self-help as a concept is relatively new. It's basically late 1800s, maybe 1900, around that time period. It's relatively new. I just bring it up because, you know, the conversation me and Daniel had on Conversations, I think it was outstanding. And I think one particular part we got on was this question of virtue related to a definitional object versus, and I thought this was outstanding. This is Daniel's coinage, particle objects of individual persons. There's that really beautiful difference being drawn out on that. Material objects can be they have a definition that can be attached to them. Persons don't have definitions, but yet they're definite. It's a really fascinating contradiction or just challenge in there. And partly because persons you can have a relationship with, individual things you can have individual relationships with, and they have a certain kind of, I mean, I use a language from Plato, definite access. They're definite, but there's something excessive about them, right? That can cause a lot of anxiety. And I bring that up related to what Sam said about specifically conflict. And I find the better self-help is very direct about that. It says actually most of our problems we try to avoid conflict. When in reality, it's in conflict, truth really gets revealed. I mean, there's a lot of traditions for that. Even in academia, the idea that an argument is not valid until it's challenged by a co-equal who can challenge the argument, for example. One reason why I love negotiation is basically everyone has, even the most subjective of preferences in the act of negotiation is when they come to collision, and then their resolution has to come through with that. Which is funny because a lot of times we normally think adversarial conflict is usually harmful, but there is an orientation I think that is fair to say conflict is justified and is perfectly reasonable. There's some truth that gets revealed from those acts of conflict resonating with each other. I just had a meditation about that. I think in particular what Sam said about the hope orientation, it's really fascinating because it's almost as if like that conflict with her friend was like the kind of center of gravity of the self-organization of the friendship as an entity was basically put to question. And through discourse, it got revealed that origin, that kind of origin principle point of hope for one individual is not orienting with the other. It's not resonating. You know, I mean, Aristotle will be very clear about that, right? That there's different modes of interactions of friendship, right? Utility, pleasure, and virtue. And quite frankly, if you're not in alignment of your virtue, then you cannot have a friendship on that ground. It's just not going to happen. And there's another discussion that is actually a very interesting discussion. If a man becomes a god, should his friend want him to become a god? Because the price to be paid of that is that he loses his friendship, because gods and mortals cannot be friends from a Aristotelian point of view. Very fascinating note about that. One would make the argument, I think if I remember correctly, what Aristotle closes on, it says, basically, if you wish the good of your friend, you should. But the reality is they will no longer be a man at that point. They will now be something else. So, qual friend, yes, but at that moment, that transition, now you're no longer friends. So it's changed. The relationship has changed. I think that's quite nuanced and really interesting. I think I was brought up by Matthew, the idea of maturity, right? That's kind of the point, is not maturity kind of the idea that one can be ruled by principle, that there are things more important than myself, that I need to orient myself to. That's why I'm bringing up this idea of this kind of self-organizing principle that orients people together. It's the grounds of even how you're able to relate to each other. And more importantly, self-regulate each other too, right? There's a line from Aristotle that wisdom gives command, not by an order of authority, like not by a tyrant's order, but by a principle that directs. So it's quite different. It's almost like, it's actually what Daniel, when you were hinting at the end of that, the beautiful as a compeller. It's not the compelling of a tyrannical kind of necessity. It is a kind of logical, it's the naturally flowing consequence of people who fall in love with the same principle that orient themselves together. It's quite nuanced. Well, last note, just about the time aspect too. You know, there's lots of accounts, I mean, from the Old Testament and whatnot. Time, you can have division, separations of people for decades, and yet you can have, I believe, oh God, there was the two brothers, right? The one tricks the other one. I forgot the Old Testament. My mind's blanking. But basically, they were separated for decades, and then eventually a reconciliation occurred, and they cried together. There's almost, and I've also had friendships that I've had to dissolve. But yeah, I always, even though I knew injustice, I did the right. I confronted it. We had the addressing, and the resolution was it was the breakage of the relationship. But yet, in my heart, I still have this wish and hope that it will be restored at some point. I think it's also a very nuanced point, right? So as opposed to a transaction where there's a voiding of a contract, right? And you separate the relationship, it's kind of packed up. These relationships, these kind of relationships of love, right, of friendship of different modes and orientations, they tend to have this, even when there's a rupture or a breakage or something like that, there's a kind of sense, as long as, I mean, actually one can make the argument, even beyond death, but with the hope while still alive, this can be reconciliated. But even in death, if that does happen, I know this, that I have a friend, for example, if he died, I would go to his funeral. Even with the breakage, I would still go. I would go visit his grave if I was in the area, for example. I would still do it, even despite the breakage. Aristotle has a comment about that, like basically what happens if you lose a friend. And it says that, you know, obviously if a man falls into vice, and even after consult, like addressing and hoping that they will correct their way, they don't, you have no choice. You're basically, by the logic of the relationship of the virtue, you're loose, that was gone now. You cannot be friends no longer. You still have the memory of the friendship, and that justifies it. It makes it know that it justifies a certain candor, a well-wishing, right, for that other. So there's like some real, that's kind of the, but notice here, like notice that's like, it's not even based on, I brought this up before in the past, in like many ago net groups. It's not just a bundling of a collection of memories. It's not just like this aggregation of things, nor the utility principle about orientation, nor the pleasure principle here that justifies orientation. It's this idea of friendship for friendship's sake, like this virtue orientation that is really nuanced. And I'll just close on this last kind of loop point. It's very difficult to talk about the virtue of individual people, no? It's very challenging. Me and Daniel started riffing some ideas about it, but I'm not satisfied with that. And I think, quite frankly, I need to meditate more on that question, because there's a very big difference talking about the virtue of man qua definition, right, a rational animal. And then thus the argument is either well deliberation or acquiring of wisdom to live well with a healthy body and like all that kind of stuff. It seems like you can make an argument, you can work that through, and then thus like, well, then thus the individual is just the individuated prudence to acquire, apply, and preserve that virtue for man, as a man, as a human being, for example. That doesn't seem the right story, or not the complete part. And I hinted at that. Said really, an individual person, you know, Sam, myself, Daniel, Michelle, right? What everybody else on this call. That answer of our virtue, of our excellence, can only be told in narrative. That's why, Luber, I'm glad you're here. You're like my go-to for narrative. And I feel like that's the only answer. The answer is, did he live a good life? Did Thomas live a good life? Well, you have to tell his story. What is the account of him? By his story as a man, not as just this abstractional object. And maybe then also I had a little note about this, the idea of really the best of men, individuated, become exemplars, right? Jesus, Martin Luther King, take your pick. They become something absolutely excessively excess to what they are when they lived, where now they are actually a kind of entity that could be referenced with intelligibility, and you can actually start asking kind of hypothetical questions with enough maturity to say, what would Jesus do? Like that's almost an operation when I was hinting at the idea of like a person with maturity is ordered by a principle that guides them, and then these mental actions of what would X do, what would this exemplar do in this circumstance, is kind of a demonstration of that. It's quite interesting. Okay, that's what I got.
Outstanding. You said a bunch that was really, really wonderful. I'll pass this to Luber, and then if anyone has final things, please. I'm really taken. Alas, our beloved Jacob Kashir, when I had a talk the other day with him and Tim, and what you were saying on story was very interesting right there. And Tim was making the point that one of the differences between classical education and modern education is in modern education, If I give you a story, I ask you questions. Who was the main character? What was the setting? You know, that's what the teacher does. They ask you these kind of questions. Where classically, the elder or the teacher would tell a story and then sit back and watch to see how the kids responded. And the education was the response to the story, not if they memorized all the information. And one of the things that Tim was getting at is we sort children socially, hierarchically, skill level, intelligence according to their ability to know the information of a story, not in regard to them discerning not in regard to the response to the story. Like one of the things that he was pointing out, like in Seneca, for example, you know, if I tell you, obviously Seneca's not talking about the Lord of the Rings, but if I tell you about the Lord of the Rings, and one of the children in the room says, well, I think Saruman, he's the best. He was like the great character. The teacher would go, we need to take him and do some special training with that kid. With the kid who says, no, Frodo, you know, you say, okay, that kid is responding to the story in the proper way. They are apprehending the proper theme. What's so interesting, I had to say theme because I'm going to pass it to Luber here. What's interesting is that I was thinking about Luber and Alex, is that Tim was basically suggesting that classical education was telling a story to see if the children would apprehend the theme or not, to apprehend the virtue or not, what was good or what was bad, and then the education would go around that. I wonder if then individual virtue is only determinable by the response of children to your story. So after you die, how do children respond to your story? And that tends to be the test of virtue. Otherwise, it's a list. Otherwise, you're maybe transactional. There is something about the question of how children might respond to your story that could suggest if you lived a theme, if you lived a virtue, et cetera, and so forth. So I've been thinking about that in regard to the question, because it does seem problematic to say, the individual, if you separate the question of the individual from story, that seems problematic. But then someone who is in a story doesn't think about being in a story. They just unfold with the action, with the theme. But then how do you yourself know if you did that? It's almost like that cannot be determined except from the response of children after you die to your story. Or maybe you're still alive, you're just not there, and you just see how the children respond. So it's interesting because it's almost like the question of virtue that you're pointing at, Mr. Jockin, it requires some kind of response from the other. And then the question is, what is the best way to present yourself for the proper response? And I was just quite taken what Tim was saying about telling the story and seeing how the children respond. There's more to say, but let me give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, I was hoping I would see your puppy. And Emilio, it's a pleasure, sir. Thank you for being here. Good to, there it is. Friends. I hope that's on the car. We're down to the last one, ladies and gentlemen. One more friend and we're good to go. Mr. Luber, go right ahead. Oh, that would be great while you're in the car with the puppy. That was just playing on the radio and different things. So Mr. Luber.
You're so funny. He just woke up. But yeah, he was just sleeping. I'm sick that I missed a lot of the conversation and like what Sam was saying. It seemed like what Sam said was fire. But anyway, and I think there's so much that was just said just there at the back end. Jockin just had finished his thought. I'm like, I know what to say. And then Daniel comes in and it just scrambles me all up. Well, I guess I'll just say the first thing is me, Daniel, Alex, we finished the book. So I would love for you guys to read it. No pressure, but I would love to send it to you guys for you guys to read it. Anyway, I think the question regarding response is deeply contingent off of vulnerability. I think the key here is what does it mean to be vulnerable? And how do we understand vulnerability? I think in a very crude sense, a lot of people don't want to be vulnerable. And in that sense, they can't have a shared response. Because the only way to have a response is to be vulnerable, being open to something inflicting you to respond to. And you have to be open insofar as you are not the only kind of open in that moment, if that makes sense. There's all these different types of vulnerabilities. You can take the same situation and there could be 3 different people that have their own different vulnerable set, if you call it, and they aren't compatible. They're approaching the situations like, I'm offended because of X, says person A. Person B says, I'm offended because of Y, and then C says Z. if they aren't aware of the ground of their vulnerability, then they can't actually respond to the situation together. So it kind of goes back to like the origin with like Heidegger. The only way to go back to the origin is that you're vulnerable to your origin. I think this is my origin, and I think it is this because of that, but let's see. What do you think, Daniel, Clayton, Phillip, Michelle, Sam, whoever, Thomas? Like, I have to not hold my vulnerability in such a way that it cuts off other people's ability to be vulnerable. So I think, like, with friendship, just like kind of the stuff that I feel like I was catching with what Jockin was saying is, if you're so vulnerable where you're just willing to destroy yourself and your conception on a situation, how can you fail? I'm committed to destroying myself for the sake of having a shared response. How can you fail? You can't. It's just really hard to do that because it's emotionally stressful. You have to like not ignore your emotions per se, but you have to not take what you feel as absolute. And you have to be open to these different conceptions of the same situation. And you, I think there's a certain want. Like, I don't want to talk too much about story and theme, but just if you are telling a story and you're just watching the response and you're not really provoking, like, oh, do you have questions about the first act? Or like you're already structuring the viewer's way of responding, you're not actually wanting them to respond. You really just want them to say what you are thinking. And in that sense, to tell a story and then to be silent and hearken is so difficult, because that means there's a chance that someone completely has a different understanding of the story that you told, and you're the one that told it, and yet it has to be compatible with you being the origin of that story in a certain sense. And that's like devastating. Like, I've told so many stories where I'm like I'm thinking like 5-6 years ago, where I'm like, okay, I'm like trying to say something so specific, like something about free will, this little niche thing about free will. And then someone else comes in and is like, oh, so like there's no free will. I'm like, no. But the truth is, what I'm looking back now, it's like, I'm happy they say that. I'm happy that it's such a different thought than the one I had going into telling my story, because that just means that the story is so real, that the reality of the story, in a certain sense, is difference itself. Is like, for me to think what I am thinking regarding my story as being something to do with free will, someone else needs to think of it as not regarding that, and it's something that it's regarding something completely different. And this is making me think. A few months ago on the net, I know it was me, Ebert, and Daniel talking about this, but like Ebert makes music. He has a popular song called Truth, but there's like this whistle in the song. There's so many other songs that have whistles that kind of give you that same feeling, and yet it's like all these songs kind of come from the same thought, and yet are like interpreted and expressed differently. And that just gives credence to the fact that like whatever this like emotion, this feeling that the song is emanating, it's so real that it literally requires the individual to have their own unique expression toward it. And like, I think music's a great example of like it telling like you being inspired by a song and then you making a song because you're inspired by a different song. The song can't tell you how should you question the song? It's just a pure feeling. It's like, oh, I'm going to make a remix to this and do this, because it opened me up. It made me vulnerable to the origin of where that song came from. Yeah, I could say more, but I know, Dan, you gotta go. So I'll pass it off.
I love you, Andrew Lubert. No, that was beautiful,
Love you too,
and
man.
absolutely yes on the book. It's fantastic. I really like this idea of being vulnerable to the origin. I think that's pretty powerful. I'm also taken as we come up on the end, but if anyone has closing things to say, please let me know. And Clayton Cheaton, good to see you, everyone. It's just a delight. And Clayton being here so early, so thank you, sir. Appreciate it, Clayton. I'm taken by this notion of you have to give something over to interpretation. Also, is Phillip in a hot tub, or was he in the hospital because he was in a wreck? Because I'm not sure. Phillip, are you in a hot tub, or are you in like the medical ward?
That's my unicorn.
Friends. I really do feel like a friend now that you've shown me that. Thank you, Phillip.
No, here's a question I've been having just while listening. Like, do people do what they can?
As in the best that they can, what they can, sort of things, just in general.
Yeah, let's just say like Daniel, you can spend 10 years reading for 3 hours a day.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, all right, I'm gonna do it because I can. And someone else is like, no, I'd rather stack bills. And then there comes a point where you're like, well, because I can do these things, I can't do these things. And if you're around people and they have the ability to do all these things that you're not able to do, that is even to say to suffer the insufferable, which I find often in this circle is like small talk. And just being like, wow, like, okay, do I want to see more or less of that in the world? Some people, I can't make $300,000 in a year. Some people can make that in a minute. Do you ask people to do things that they can, or to not do things that they can't do by writing legislation? Or do you ask them to set a limit on themselves? And how does like each sort of layer of the tiramisu have to, if you want to make any kind of individual statement, come down to an honest appraisal of what that individual can or cannot do? And I think one of the scariest things is there's a huge gap between like what one individual can do and maybe like what the average can do. And I think a lot of like the 20th century is a bloody dispute over that question. Should it be the state? Should it be the whatever, the market? So as far as friends, like this is where grace and forgiveness comes in. If you think someone can do something and they don't, how do you know that they can? And you might base it off of past performance. But then it also gets back to this place of like trust and holding the bird with the open hand. So it's been a lot of fun today. If I could shut down the internet, I might do it before you make your countdown go to 0.
Oh crap, it didn't count. It was too friggin' heavy metal. I'll give it right to Mr. Jockey because I think it's a wonderful question. Mr. Jockey, please.
No, I mean, Phil closed with an amazing question. I wish I got more. That's a whole kind of conversation by itself, because it's presupposed, as what I just meant. It's just a reinforcement of this interfacing of the virtue of man qua man, like as a basically abstractional definition versus individuals. Like that'd be one of the ways you would apply that. It's like, yeah, because human beings have certain capacities. You're a human being. You got to do X. Like that. That's the implication right there. So that's one of the presuppositions. Of course, that's a huge mess because generally, actually, because the problem is actually most human beings we're all lacking. That's kind of the key. And in fact, that's kind of the whole point is that what Daniel, again, I watch that conversation. I'm not even for my own self-promotion, but for what Daniel added to the conversation, because what Daniel added was absolutely fire. This argument of individuals as partial objects, which are always lacking, is quite powerful because that's the critique challenge back. It's like, yeah, by you are, if you use a virtue ethics argument, you as a substance, as man, have an ageia and dumasis, and your dumasis is two, nature and capacity. You have a nature to have intellect, all these other things, and then you have certain capacities as a response of that you can release it at a given time. And your anageia, intrinsic action of the moment, is one of the applications of it. but that's kind of the whole shtick on it, is that that's fine, but then the problem is your individual, they're interfacing with those capacities and actualities. Those are the challenges about it. That's kind of the tension that has to be answered. So I'll close with that. But again, this is more for me just promoting the conversation with OG Rose tomorrow on Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern for Daniel, not even for me, because I think Dan did an outstanding contribution to that conversation.
Frick, Jockin's so much freaking fire. Oh, come now. It was all just fire, like expertise. Jockin's expertise on these classical thinkers is just insane. So it was a wonderful conversation. And I think what Phillip had to say there was a tremendous question, because it is like this ability to identify, yes, you can. It makes me think, again, because I'm going to bring Dante back. Like, how is it that Dante, yeah, you can climb, you can handle the process. What does Beatrice see? What does Dante see in Beatrice? What's going on? There's something about wisdom having this ability to discern a canness that is not given in the facticity. And that's also too, like, for me, I just use that image of seeing the big picture suddenly. Like, there's some ability of maturity or conditioning that an individual can go through to see, yes, you can. You're not actually living up to that canness. And I actually do think the problem is the 20th century, and then this is my obsession with belonging again, is that the 20th century is a long story of saying, well, if people can't do it, the state can. No, they can't. Well, if people can't do it, the market will organize people freely. It can't. Yeah, it doesn't. Okay, well, then where's it? What do you do? You start looking at commons, community, friendship, and different things like that, because there is some ability to, because it's weird, because if I say you can do something that you can't, then it's cruel, right? But if I say if I kind of encourage you to do something that I know you can do, and I don't encourage you, then that's cruel. So there's a fittingness that is part of this that is tied to unclear, ungiven metrics. And yet they don't seem to be subjective. They seem to be kind of objective. They seem to, in a way, be part of the partial object of the person, that you're identifying the partiality that could be there or fully unfold more so, that has to be encouraged. And I think maybe next week, great, like Michelle said, horse boy, you're on it. That's a wonderful question. And maybe next week we can talk about that, because it's very interesting. It does make me think, though, as some closing points and also you couldn't shut down the video and stop the song, because I've been secretly singing the song in my heart the entire time. I am at 1 million now. Sorry, buddy. Twist interior space. So interior openness. Bam. But it's like was saying this idea in Aristotle, where if you a friend in a sense, I really struggle with R words. I cannot say R and W. It's why I failed kindergarten and went to Miss Butcher's class for T1. The R's and W's, man. So it's interesting, because when Aristotle is saying there's a sense in which the friend must risk, I get stuck on that, risk. Michelle's sister is a speech pathologist, so every time she talks, she twitches. So every time she sees me talk, she twitches. So friends have to risk their friends becoming gods, in a sense, and they not becoming gods, and they lose them, in a sense, right? Because you would will the good, right? But isn't that interesting? Because it would suggest that there's a vulnerability in you are friends with the person of whom you acknowledge that kind of distancing, that breakage, that kind of thing that's been discussed could occur. Like, and it seems like a wise friendship is actually one that is aware of that being a possibility, but then even if it occurs, they're grateful for it, because it suggests something good is occurring. The friend is actually ascending in a way. And then it would suggest, actually, maybe this is the self-help we need. It's like, if you don't want to lose your friend as they become a god, that means you need to become a god too, right? So it's like, I want to stay with them. I want to fly with them. And there's a kind of motivation. You know how people say, like, if you go to the gym, bring a friend because they'll motivate you, kind of thing, right? Maybe it's a similar thing, but it's on terms of beauty, like beauty and friendship, not something that is so clearly utilitarian as going to the gym because they're inspiring you to do the reps. But then, of course, for friends to keep up with one another as such, they both have to meet the conditions of being able to sense that canness that seems to be there and not there at the same time, that sense of the partiality unfolding that's there and not there at the same time. And that seems to have a certain exclusivity to it, but it's an exclusivity that is not shutting down people from meeting, but an exclusivity that arises simply from conditioning, right? Like you're not, if you train at the gym to be able to lift 200 pounds, the guy who can't lift 200 pounds, it's not because you passed the law to say they couldn't do it. It's because it requires a certain unfolding of time to get to the place of going to the gym to do that sort of thing. So there's a natural sort of conditioning that leads to organization that is not closing off, even though it has a kind of expertise in it. And it's like, it's almost like for friends, well, then that would suggest in order for friends to stay together, they have to grow together. But they have to grow together not merely in terms of like various obvious metrics, but in terms of a certain conditioning in this apprehension of this camness. And I think that's what you're like, there's a virtue is another self. There's a kind of self that then it's like the only way to have a relation with yourself is through a friend. Like too often we try to relate to ourselves as an individual, but that's not possible. The only way to relate to yourself is with a friend, ergo a relation of virtue, ergo you require virtue to be yourself. Otherwise that relation will not be there. And I think that would therefore mean that to be a self in this sense, you must have the risk of being friends with someone who could leave you behind and you be glad of it, which then would suggest, as Michelle was talking earlier, that friendship and courage are connected, because there's always that possibility. There's always that possibility that also your friend becoming virtuous will compel you to change in ways that might be hard and alienate you from the people around you if you're to maintain the virtue yourself to stay friends with them so they don't get away with you. Like if your friend's becoming a god per se, to use that language, that means you have to become a god, but everyone around you may not like that other than your friend, right? But that's what you're going to have to do. You might have hard choices. You might, work. They'll be like, why are you reading? You'd be like, why are you reading Augustine? The church hates you now. You're reading philosophy, so you won't get hired anymore. It's like, yeah, I know. I read philosophy, so I'm not getting that job like Cheetom was saying. But if I didn't read philosophy, then I couldn't stay friends with my friends who's becoming a god. So that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. That seems to be where then there's a courage in all of this, because to stay friends with that friend, you've got to meet them in that level of virtue, which may cost you in other areas of your life. Ergo, this might be why friendship and courage seem to have some sort of connection to it. And then also in all of that, because I'm taken by this idea that Luba was saying on being, you write a story and they interpret it wrong. But then as you get older, and I think this is true, as you become a more mature writer, and then I'll give it to Phillip here, you actually learn to appreciate misunderstanding. Like, you're like, yeah, I'm actually glad because that means it's alive. A young artist, a young creator doesn't appreciate misunderstanding, but an older writer appreciates misunderstanding because misunderstanding is a sign of life. And it's almost like the virtuous one appreciates being misunderstood, because they know if they are not, then they are actually fitting into the social order in such a manner that means they are part of the average that is likely not going to reflect virtue by definition of being the average. That doesn't mean it's necessarily evil, but it may lack those conditionalities in different things. So there seems to be also something about friends, a virtuous friendship gives itself over to the society where it may be misunderstood. And I think that's a courageous act that seems to be part of, in the very act of being willing to do that, then is an act of virtue, of which then is the very willingness to give your story to children to see how they respond, which means you may not like the response. I mean, they're children after all, and yet that's what it takes. Let me give it to Phillip. Phillip.
And that's why I think a lot of us read for friendship. We're looking for something that is lacking in the quotidian, whatever you want to call it, empty speech. And I think in this way, it can kind of remind us that a precondition of love is sacrifice. It's not that you are in love and then you sacrifice to fall in love. And this reading becomes, well, maybe I could get toxic reading. Toxic reading is when you use it to like be a Pharisee or a Sadducee or whatever. You like dunk on other people. You're like, man, you must be clueless on the scroll. Although that too could be generative depending on the context. So that's all.
I think it's a beautiful idea that you sacrifice to fall in love, not fall in love to have someone to sacrifice to. It seems to be the act of sacrifice is indeed the making of a space into which someone would enter. It's almost like if you don't sacrifice, you're not doing the acts that create the interiority, that create the depths into which a person can enter, and the egos not immediately collide. There has to be enough space. In the same way that, you know, they talk about a work of art, you have to know the right distance from it to see it correctly. Like, it matters where you stand. If humans in some way are works of art or vessels of beauty potentially, then the right distance from them is proper. And that also gets into the ordering of the paradisia. There's the empty space is part of the art. The distance is the ordering. It's not distance in the negative. No, it is the proper, it's the like negation, sublation of division into artistic space that allows seeing in the proper way. And maybe without reading, without sacrifice, one does not develop the interiority to have the right space between everyone architecturally, so that everyone could observe each other as works of art, which then the image for that in Dante is the flock of birds that seem to be dancing. Everyone sees the swarm, and there's no forced order, and yet it all goes together. There's an emergent property. There's an order that is artistic. It's beautiful. We were in the parking lot of the Seth store the other Saturday watching a flock of birds, and it was the best Saturday. Best frickin' Saturday. They were like dancing and all that stuff. You've all seen that. It would seem like, again, in close, it would seem like the question of political economy today is what would it look like to have a society of flocking birds and Dante, as opposed to a block or a chaos. And it seemed to have something to do with the capacity for people to sacrifice to fall in love, to create interior spaces, to have the right distance so they can flow together, and the willingness to give themselves over as a story that could be misinterpreted to others, because that is the act of virtue that makes it possible to be together as friends. Everyone, this has been a complete delight. I really enjoyed this. Thank you for your time today. You all rock. Thank you all. Have a great one. All the best. All the best. All the best.